in connection with functions and states of consciousness, and from the point of view of his possible evolution, man is divided into 7 categories. People are born only in one of the 3 first categories. A person in whom the instinctive or moving function predominates, and in whom intellectual and emotional functions are less developed, is called man number 1. But if the emotional function predominates over the other functions, he is called man number 2, and if the intellectual function predominates, he is man number 3. Beyond these 3 kinds of men, but not born as such, is man number 4. This means the beginning of change, chiefly in consciousness but also in knowledge and capacity for observation. Next comes man number 5, who has already developed in himself the 3rd state of consciousness, that is, self-consciousness, and in whom the higher emotional function works. Next is man number 6, and finally man number 7, who has full objective consciousness and in whom the higher intellectual function works. Questioner: how can one recognize a higher man than ourselves as we do not know what to look for? Ouspensky: when we know better what is lacking in us, what the things are that we ascribe to ourselves but do not possess, we shall begin to see something about it, although actually we can distinguish people of a high level only by their knowledge. If they know something that we do not know, and if we realize that no one else knows it, and that it could not be learned in any ordinary way, that may serve as a guide. Try to think a little about the characteristics of these 7 categories of man. For instance, what could be the general characteristics of man 1, 2 and 3? First of all, sleep. Man 1, 2 and 3, before he begins to study himself in connection with some system which gives him the possibility of self-study, passes all his life in sleep. He only looks as though he is awake. He is really never awake, or occasionally he awakes for a moment, looks round and falls asleep again. This is the first characteristic of man 1, 2 and 3. The second characteristic is the fact that though he has many different eyes, some of these eyes do not even know one another. Man can have quite definite attitudes, definite convictions or definite views, and on the other hand he can have quite different convictions, quite different views, quite different likes and different dislikes, and one of them does not know the other. This is one of the chief characteristics of man 1, 2 and 3. Men are very divided and they do not know and cannot know it, because each of these eyes knows only certain eyes that it meets by association. Other eyes remain quite unknown. Eyes are divided according to functions. There are intellectual, emotional, instinctive and moving eyes. Round themselves they know something, but beyond that they know nothing. So until man begins to study himself with knowledge of this division, he can never come to a right understanding of his functions or reactions. The sleep of man, an absence of unity in him, create another very important characteristic, and this is the complete mechanicalness of man. Man in this state, man 1, 2 and 3, is a machine controlled by external influences. He has no possibility to resist these external influences, and no possibility to distinguish them from one another, no possibility to study himself apart from these things. He sees himself always on the move, and has a long-established and very strong illusion that he is free to go where he wills, that he can move according to his wish, and that he can go to the right or to the left. He cannot do this. If he moves to the right, that means that he could not move to the left. Will is quite a wrong idea. It does not exist. Will can exist only in man who has one controlling eye, but as long as he has many different eyes which do not know one another, he has just as many different wills. Each eye has its own will. There can be no other eye or other will. But man can come to a state when he acquires a controlling I and when he acquires will. He can reach this state only by developing consciousness. These are the rudiments of the principles of this system. Now I just want to say one thing more. We begin with psychology, study of oneself, of the human machine, of states of consciousness, methods of correcting things and so on. But at the same time an important part of the system is given to doctrines of general laws of the world, because we cannot understand even ourselves if we do not know some of the fundamental laws which lie behind all things. Ordinary scientific knowledge is not sufficient for this, because, just as such important points as absence of self-remembering were missed in psychology, so our science either forgot or never knew the fundamental laws on which everything is based. As I said, all things in the world, whether big or small, on every scale, are based on two fundamental laws, which in this system are called the law of three and the law of seven. The law of three, in a short description, means that three forces enter into every manifestation, into every phenomenon and every event. They are called, but these are only words, because they do not express their qualities, positive, negative and neutralizing, or active, passive and neutralizing, or still more simply, they may be called first force, second force and third force. These three forces enter into everything. In many cases we understand the need of two forces, that one force cannot create an action, that there is action and resistance. But generally we are not aware of the third force. This is connected with the state of our being, the state of our consciousness. In another state we would be aware of it in many cases where we do not see it now. Sometimes we can find examples of third force in ordinary scientific study. For example, in chemistry and in biology we can find the necessity of a third force in the creation of events and phenomena. We begin with the study of psychology. Later we shall talk more about three forces and we may find some examples of their interaction. But it is better to be prepared and get accustomed now to the idea of the need to study these three forces. The law of seven must also be described briefly. It means that no process in the world goes without interruptions. To illustrate this idea, let us take a certain period of activity in which vibrations are increasing. Suppose they begin at 1000 vibrations a second and increase to 2000 vibrations a second. This period is called an octave, because this law was applied to music and the period was divided into 7 notes and a repetition of the first note. The octave, particularly the major octave, is really a picture or formula of a cosmic law, because, in cosmic arrangements, within one octave there are 2 moments when vibrations slow down by themselves. Vibrations do not develop regularly. In the major octave this is shown by the missing semitones. That is why we are told that it is a picture of a cosmic law. But this law has nothing to do with music. The reason why it is necessary to understand the law of seven is that it plays a very important part in all events. If there were no law of seven, everything in the world would go to its final conclusion. But because of this law everything deviates. For instance, if rain began it would go on without stopping. If floods began they would cover everything. If an earthquake began it would go on indefinitely. But they stop, because of the law of seven. Because at every missing semitone things deviate, they do not go by straight lines. The law of seven also explains why there are no straight lines in nature. Everything in our life and our machine is also based on this law. So we shall study it in the work of our organism, because we have to study ourselves not only psychologically, not only in connection with our mental life, but also in connection with our physical life. In our physical processes we find many examples of the working of this law. At the same time, the law of 7 explains that, if you know how and at what moment to do it, you can give an additional shock to an octave and keep the line straight. We can observe in human activity how people start to do one thing and after some time do quite a different thing, still calling it by the first name without noticing that things have completely changed. But in personal work, particularly in work connected with this system, we must learn how to keep these octaves from deviating, how to keep a straight line.